Welcome to another virtual field trip at the Ken Waterloo Region Museum. Today, we're talking about the three main groups of people that were living right here in the region 200 years ago. Those groups were the Indigenous or First Nations, the European settlers, and the Black settlers. This is our second video about the Black settlers here in the region of Waterloo. In our first video, we talked a little bit about how many of the Blacks coming to this area were trying to escape slavery, whether because they had been enslaved and were fleeing those who enslaved them, or because they were free and afraid of being captured and sold into or back into slavery. Many of them came to Canada because they hoped that they would be free and safe here after Canada abolished slavery. However, once they got here, life was not quite as easy as they might have hoped. There were many Black communities throughout Canada, but in this area, the first was called Cobornesburg and was near where Winterbourne is today. It was established sometime around 1830, and it was described in 1832 as a success. But many Black settlers did not stay for long. While Black settlers moved to all different areas across what is now Ontario, some of the Black settlers from Cobornesburg ended up moving into the Queen's Bush. This area was called the Queen's Bush because the land belonged to the Queen of England, Queen Victoria. It was a very large piece of land that included the area in Wellesley Township and Peel Township, which is now part of Wellington County. Because the land belonged to Queen Victoria, the land in the Queen's Bush wasn't technically for sale, which meant those living there, both Black and white, were squatting. Now, squatting is a word with two meanings. It can mean crouching low to the ground like I am right now, or it can mean living in a place that doesn't belong to you. However, most of the people who were squatting in the Queen's Bush hoped that eventually, when the land came up for sale, they would be able to purchase the land they were living on. Living in the Queen's Bush was extremely dangerous and oftentimes lonely. The roads there were almost non-existent. At certain times of the year, they were impassable. This meant that the settlers of the Queen's Bush were cut off from towns and more established farms where they might be able to get help. They were alone in the wilderness. They had to build their own places to live and began clearing the land so that they could farm. But unlike the European settlers, they had not brought tools with them and did not have money to buy tools or supplies to help them. It took a lot of determination and hard work. Often, the only house they would be able to build measured about 2 meters by 3 meters. That's 6 by 9 feet. It was 2.5 meters or 7.5 feet high at the front, but it sloped back so that it was only about 1 meter or 3 feet tall at the back. There were often no windows, very little, if any, furnishings, and a small hole in the ceiling for the smoke to escape from the fire that would help them keep warm and allow them to cook their food. They often didn't even have proper clothing for the cold Canadian winters, especially since many of them had traveled very far from the south. Many people in the Queen's Bush also needed to find a way to make money so they could buy the supplies they needed to clear their land and build bigger houses. This meant that they would travel long distances to farms to be day laborers. Day laborers would spend a day working on someone else's farm in exchange for a small amount of money and some food. However, every day that they spent working on someone else's farm was a day that they weren't working on their own farm. This meant that many of the farms in the Queen's Bush took much longer to get started and established than the other farms in surrounding areas. Slowly but surely, many settlers in the Queen's Bush were able to build better log cabins with windows and furniture, and the settlement grew until there was 2,500 people living there, 1,500 of whom were Black. We'll find out what happened to the Queen's Bush settlement in our next video. But for now, I invite you to think about how you would have built a shelter in the Queen's Bush to survive the weather that we have here in Canada. What sort of materials would you have used? Where would you have gotten them? How big would you make it? Remember, the average size of the Queensbush original homes was only 2 meters by 3 meters. Try measuring this out somewhere in your home. Maybe with the permission of your adults, you can try using some tables and chairs to reconstruct a shelter to see what it might have been like to live in one.